The man who laughed at her $19 shoes would soon trust her with a deal worth more than $2 billion. Nobody in the grand ballroom of the Meridian International Hotel could have imagined that. Not the diplomats stepping out of black SUVs. Not the executives adjusting tailored suits worth more than some people's monthly rent. And certainly not Ethan Caldwell. The crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors as guests from 12 countries gathered for one of the most important international business summits of the year. Conversations drifted through the room in a dozen accents. Expensive watches caught the light. Handshakes carried the weight of careers. Every detail had been planned down to the minute. Every detail except Claire Whitmore. She moved quietly between tables carrying trays of coffee and sparkling water. At 28, she looked like any other hotel waitress. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her uniform was spotless. Her smile was polite but reserved. Most people barely noticed her. Claire preferred it that way. She had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than conversation ever could. While executives competed to be heard, she listened. While others rushed to impress, she observed. And on mornings like this, observation was far more valuable than anyone realized. The ballroom doors opened again. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Ethan Caldwell entered surrounded by advisors and senior executives. Tall, confident, impeccably dressed. The 40-year-old CEO had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Financial magazines called him a visionary. Business networks called him a genius. Competitors called him dangerous. Ethan walked through the room with the calm certainty of a man accustomed to winning. People stepped aside without being asked. Conversations paused. Eyes followed him. Success had become part of his identity. So had judgment. He believed he could read people within seconds. Usually he was right. At least that was what he told himself. Claire approached his table carrying a fresh pot of coffee. As she poured, Ethan barely glanced up from the documents in front of him. Then his eyes drifted downward. For a brief moment, they stopped. Claire's shoes were old, clean but clearly worn. The kind of inexpensive shoes someone might buy because practicality mattered more than appearance. Ethan smirked. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. One of his executives noticed and followed his gaze. A few seconds later, another did the same. Big day for those shoes, someone joked quietly. A couple of people laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Claire heard every word. Her hand paused for half a second. Then she continued pouring coffee as if nothing had happened. No reaction, no embarrassment, no anger, just calm. Ethan returned to his papers. The moment lasted less than 10 seconds. Forgotten almost immediately by everyone except Claire. Outside, dark clouds gathered beyond the glass walls overlooking the city skyline. Inside, translators prepared final documents. Diplomats reviewed negotiation terms. Attorneys checked compliance agreements one last time. The summit would begin in less than an hour. Billions of dollars. Thousands of jobs. Years of international planning. Everything depended on what happened next. And while executives focused on contracts and presentations, a waitress in $19 shoes quietly placed the last coffee cup on the table and noticed something that nobody else had seen. Claire Whitmore had become very good at being invisible. The skill had not come naturally. It had been learned one difficult day at a time. As the ballroom grew busier, she moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups, adjusting place settings, and responding to requests before guests even realized they had them. Most people saw a waitress. Nothing more. That was exactly what they were supposed to see. A diplomat from Germany requested mineral water. Claire already knew which brand he preferred because she had served him during 2 previous conferences. A representative from South Korea asked for extra tea. She remembered he disliked coffee afternoon. Small details, tiny observations, the kind that rarely earned attention but often made people feel understood. She carried another tray toward the service station near the back of the ballroom. The moment she stepped through the doors, the noise faded. The quiet hallway beyond felt like a different world. She exhaled slowly. For a few seconds, she allowed herself a break from the performance of being unnoticed. From inside her apron pocket, she pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn from being handled too often. On it was a handwritten list. Rent, student loan payment, her mother's physical therapy appointment, utility bill, grocery budget. Claire studied the numbers and quietly folded the paper again. There was nothing dramatic about her life. No secret fortune waiting to be discovered. No miracle solution around the corner. Just responsibilities. The kind that arrived every month without fail. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Claire, ballroom A needs more coffee service. She turned and smiled politely at her manager. I am on my way. The manager nodded and hurried off. Claire returned to work. As she walked back toward the ballroom, her eyes briefly drifted toward the framed windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Gray clouds continued gathering above the city. The skyline looked muted beneath the approaching weather. She had always liked storms. There was honesty in them. No pretending. No polished speeches. No expensive suits. Just nature reminding everyone that some things could not be controlled. Back inside the ballroom, preparations were entering their final stage. Security teams checked entrances. Translators organized documents. Legal advisors reviewed contracts one final time. Claire noticed all of it, not because she was curious, because observation had become habit. Years ago, she had spent her days studying negotiation strategy, international communication, and cultural dynamics. Back then, she imagined a very different future, one filled with conference rooms instead of serving trays. But life rarely followed the plans people made at 20 years old. Sometimes responsibility arrived first. Dreams waited their turn. Sometimes they waited much longer than expected. A burst of laughter drew her attention across the room. Ethan Caldwell stood near a large digital presentation screen speaking with senior executives and international partners. He looked completely at ease. Every gesture controlled. Every word measured. People listened when he spoke. Claire watched only briefly before returning to her work. She held no resentment over the comment about her shoes. In her experience, people often revealed more about themselves than about others when they made judgments. The truly surprising thing was not that Ethan had underestimated her. It was how many people had followed his lead without thinking. She adjusted a stack of presentation folders near one of the reserved tables. That was when she noticed it again. The same detail she had spotted earlier. A document. A translation note attached to one of the briefing packets. Small, easy to overlook, but something about it felt wrong. Claire paused. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she looked toward the main conference stage where delegates from multiple countries were beginning to take their seats. A quiet feeling settled in her stomach. The kind that appears when a puzzle piece does not fit where it should. Around her, nobody seemed concerned. Nobody else appeared to have noticed. Yet the more Claire looked at the document, the more certain she became that a mistake had already entered the room long before the negotiations had even begun. The summit officially began at 9 o'clock sharp. One by one, representatives from different nations took their seats around the massive oval conference table positioned beneath the ballroom's towering chandeliers. Translation headsets rested beside every folder. Digital displays illuminated with company logos and financial projections. Cameras from international business networks quietly recorded the opening remarks. Everything appeared flawless. That was exactly what worried Claire. She stood near the rear service station with a coffee pot balanced carefully in her hands. To everyone else, she looked focused on hospitality. In reality, her attention remained fixed on the briefing packet she had noticed minutes earlier. The problem was subtle, almost invisible, but the longer she thought about it, the more troubling it became. The translation attached to one of the negotiation documents was technically correct. Every word matched. Every sentence appeared accurate. Yet the meaning behind those words had shifted. It was the kind of mistake language software often missed. The kind that occurred when translators understood vocabulary but failed to understand culture. Claire knew the difference. In international negotiations, one poorly translated phrase could change the emotional tone of an entire discussion. Respect could become arrogance. Partnership could become control. Cooperation could become insult. The words remained similar. The consequences did not. Across the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell stepped onto the stage. The room immediately grew quiet. Confidence radiated from him as naturally as breathing. He welcomed delegates, investors, and government representatives before outlining the significance of the agreement everyone had gathered to finalize. The proposed partnership would connect emerging technology infrastructure across multiple regions. The projected value exceeded $2 billion. More importantly, it represented years of relationship building between people from very different cultures. Ethan understood business. He understood numbers. He understood strategy. Those strengths had carried him to extraordinary success. But there was one thing he rarely considered: the hidden details that never appeared in financial reports. The details Claire had spent years studying. As applause filled the room, Claire glanced again toward the document. Her concern deepened. A phrase intended to express mutual cooperation had been translated into wording that implied authority over the receiving party. To an American executive, the difference might seem insignificant. To the delegation preparing to arrive from the Middle East, it could be interpreted very differently. Claire knew enough about the region's diplomatic traditions to recognize the danger. Respect mattered. Honor mattered. Nuance mattered. And once offense entered a negotiation, removing it was never easy. She considered speaking to someone, then immediately dismissed the idea. Who would listen? She was a waitress carrying coffee. The translators assigned to the summit possessed impressive credentials. The legal team consisted of highly paid experts. Ethan Caldwell employed some of the most accomplished professionals in the industry. Claire imagined herself approaching one of them. "Excuse me, I think there is a cultural issue in your translation packet." The thought almost made her smile. They would assume she was confused. Or worse, they would politely thank her and ignore the warning entirely. The opening session continued. Delegates exchanged greetings. Advisors reviewed schedules. Staff members moved efficiently through the ballroom. Yet Claire could not shake the feeling that a storm was approaching. Not the weather outside. Something else. Something already moving beneath the surface. Then she noticed a familiar name appear on one of the presentation screens. The lead international delegation had just arrived at the hotel and would be entering the ballroom within minutes. Claire's grip tightened slightly around the coffee pot. The document was no longer a potential problem. It was about to become a real one. And somewhere across the room, Ethan Caldwell smiled confidently, as though everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened with quiet elegance. Conversations softened immediately. Heads turned. The international delegation had arrived. Men and women in dark tailored suits entered alongside advisors, legal representatives, and cultural consultants. Their expressions were professional, reserved, careful. This was not merely a business meeting. It was the culmination of nearly 3 years of negotiations. 3 years of travel, planning, compromise, and trust building. One mistake today could unravel all of it. Ethan Caldwell stepped forward with an easy smile and extended his hand in greeting. Cameras captured every moment. Reporters quietly took notes from the designated media area. The atmosphere remained warm, respectful, optimistic. For now, Claire watched from across the room while arranging fresh coffee service along the rear tables. The briefing packet remained in her thoughts. She had hoped someone else might catch the issue before the meeting began. Nobody had. The translated documents were already distributed. The delegates were already seated. The first presentations were already underway. The window for preventing a problem was shrinking with every passing minute. Ethan stood at the center of the room, delivering opening remarks. His voice was calm and measured. He spoke about innovation, shared opportunities, long-term cooperation. The audience listened attentively. Several delegates nodded in agreement. Everything appeared to be moving smoothly. Then the printed negotiation packets were opened. Claire noticed it immediately. One senior delegate glanced down at a page. His eyes paused. A second delegate looked at the same section moments later. The subtle change in posture was almost invisible. A slight tightening around the eyes. A brief exchange of glances. Nothing dramatic. But Claire recognized the signal. Something had landed incorrectly. The presentation continued. Ethan remained unaware. So did most of his executive team. The translators sat confidently near the front of the room. The legal advisors focused on schedules and projections. Meanwhile, the emotional temperature inside the delegation had begun to shift. Slowly, quietly, dangerously, Claire carried a tray toward a nearby service station and found herself within earshot of several advisors discussing the agreement. The problematic phrase appeared again, spoken aloud this time. The English version sounded harmless, even positive. Yet Claire knew how it would be interpreted by people raised in a different cultural framework. The wording implied oversight rather than partnership, direction rather than collaboration. To many Americans, the distinction seemed minor. To others, it could suggest disrespect. A younger executive standing near Ethan laughed lightly while reviewing the documents. "This deal is practically done," he said. "Nothing can stop it now." Several people smiled. Confidence filled the room. Claire looked down briefly. Confidence was useful. Overconfidence was expensive. The meeting moved into its next phase. Financial projections appeared on giant screens. Charts displayed future growth. Revenue forecasts drew approving reactions. Yet the delegation that had seemed relaxed upon arrival now appeared noticeably more reserved. They spoke less. Their smiles faded. Questions became shorter. Formal. Careful. Ethan finally seemed to notice the change. His expression remained composed, but his eyes sharpened slightly. He was too experienced not to sense when momentum shifted. One of the delegates leaned toward an interpreter and quietly asked a question. The interpreter responded. The delegate's expression darkened further. Another advisor joined the conversation. Then another. A ripple moved through their side of the table. Small at first, but growing. Claire felt the familiar weight of certainty settle into her chest. The misunderstanding she feared was no longer theoretical. It had begun. Across the ballroom, rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago. The gray clouds had finally arrived. Inside, the room still looked calm, professional, controlled. But beneath the polished surface, something was starting to fracture. And for the first time that morning, Ethan Caldwell's confidence began to show the smallest crack. The first visible crack appeared 20 minutes later. A senior delegate adjusted his headset, closed the negotiation packet, and leaned back in his chair. The movement was calm, respectful, yet it immediately changed the energy around the table. Nearby advisors exchanged quiet words. Interpreters checked notes. Legal representatives began reviewing specific sections again. Ethan Caldwell noticed everything. Years of leading billion-dollar negotiations had trained him to recognize subtle shifts before they became problems. The room was still polite, still professional, but momentum was slipping away. He paused his presentation and invited questions from the delegation. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched longer than expected. Then one of the senior representatives cleared his throat and addressed the room through an interpreter. His tone remained courteous, yet something underneath it felt colder than before. He referenced a section of the agreement regarding future oversight and strategic guidance. Ethan listened carefully. Confusion flickered across his face. The concern seemed disconnected from the actual intent of the agreement. Their partnership proposal had never included control over the other party. It had been designed around cooperation from the beginning. Yet as the delegate continued speaking, several others nodded in agreement. They had all reached the same conclusion. Ethan glanced toward his legal team. They appeared equally surprised. One attorney quickly reviewed the relevant section. Another whispered to a translator. The translator frowned. Across the ballroom, Claire watched the realization spread from person to person like a wave moving through still water. Nobody understood why the delegation felt offended. Meanwhile, the delegation could not understand why nobody else recognized the problem. Both sides believed they were being reasonable. That was what made misunderstandings so dangerous. Rarely did they begin with bad intentions. More often, they began with assumptions. Ethan stepped forward and attempted to clarify the language. His explanation was logical, detailed, professional. Under normal circumstances, it might have worked. But the issue was no longer about literal definitions. It had become emotional, cultural, human. The distinction hidden inside the translation had quietly transformed cooperation into perceived hierarchy. And now trust was beginning to erode. Rain tapped steadily against the windows as the atmosphere inside the ballroom grew heavier. Advisors who had entered the room, smiling now, wore expressions of concern. Several investors shifted uneasily in their seats. The cameras continued recording. Every hesitation, every awkward pause, every second of uncertainty. Claire looked toward the service station where additional briefing packets had been stacked earlier that morning. The same problematic phrase appeared throughout the documents. Hundreds of pages, dozens of references. Correcting it would not be simple. One executive from Ethan's team finally leaned toward him and whispered something. Ethan listened, nodded once, then looked toward the translators. Questions were asked. Answers followed. Yet the explanations only seemed to deepen the confusion. The translators insisted the wording was accurate. Technically, they were right. That was the problem. Accuracy and meaning were not always the same thing. At the far side of the room, another delegate quietly closed his folder. Then another. The sound was soft, almost insignificant. Yet to anyone experienced in international negotiations, it sounded alarmingly loud. Claire felt her stomach tighten. The situation was approaching a point where pride would begin replacing dialogue. Once that happened, repairing the relationship would become far more difficult. Across the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell stood beneath the bright conference lights, searching for a solution he could not yet see. And for the first time all morning, the possibility of failure felt real. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence hanging over the conference table felt heavier than any argument could have. Delegates exchanged careful looks. Advisors reviewed documents they had already reviewed 3 times. Translators quietly defended their wording. Yet the uncomfortable feeling remained. Something was wrong. Ethan Caldwell stepped away from the presentation screen and approached the delegation directly. He kept his voice calm, respectful, professional. The confidence that had defined him all morning was still there, but now it carried a trace of urgency. He explained again that the partnership had been built on mutual benefit, equal opportunity, shared growth. Nothing about the agreement was intended to diminish the independence of any participating partner. Several delegates listened politely. One nodded. Another thanked him for the clarification. Yet none of them appeared convinced. The problem had moved beyond facts. It had entered perception, and perception was often more powerful than reality. Claire stood near the rear service area, pretending to organize coffee cups while watching the conversation unfold. She recognized every stage of what was happening. First came confusion, then concern, then caution. If nobody corrected the misunderstanding soon, the next stage would arrive. Withdrawal. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply a gradual decision to stop trusting the process. Rain continued streaking down the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The city skyline had nearly disappeared behind low clouds. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere felt equally obscured. A senior delegate finally spoke again through an interpreter. His words were courteous, but the message landed heavily. Trust, he explained, depended not only on financial terms, but also on mutual respect. Certain language within the proposal suggested a relationship that was not entirely balanced. Ethan listened carefully. He understood the concern. What he could not understand was where it had come from. The actual agreement said no such thing. One of his attorneys quickly produced supporting documentation. Another displayed previous drafts on a nearby monitor. Every version reflected the same intention: partnership, cooperation, equality. Yet each attempt to prove the point seemed only to create additional questions. The room was slowly becoming trapped in a cycle of explanation and misunderstanding. Claire felt her pulse quicken. The answer was right there, hidden in plain sight. A single phrase, a single cultural nuance. One small adjustment could change everything. But she remained silent, not because she doubted herself, because she doubted that anyone would listen. Nearby, 2 executives whispered anxiously about investor reactions if the agreement failed. Another checked market updates on his phone. A communications director quietly discussed contingency plans. The possibility nobody had considered that morning was becoming increasingly real. Then something unexpected happened. One member of the delegation carefully closed his folder and placed it on the table. The gesture was respectful, calm, yet its meaning was unmistakable. He was preparing to leave the discussion. Others began doing the same. The sound of folders closing echoed softly through the ballroom. Ethan's expression changed immediately. Not panic, not fear, something rarer: humility. For the first time all day, he looked less like a celebrated chief executive and more like a man searching desperately for a solution. Across the room, Claire looked down at the worn shoes that had attracted so much attention earlier that morning. Then she looked back toward the conference table. The negotiation was slipping away. The misunderstanding was growing, and a decision she had been avoiding all day could no longer be postponed. Claire stood motionless for several seconds. Around her, servers continued moving through the ballroom. Coffee was poured. Water glasses were refilled. Schedules were adjusted. From a distance, everything still looked normal. Yet she could feel the negotiations slipping away one careful step at a time. The delegates were not angry. That would have been easier. Anger could be addressed. This was something far more dangerous: disappointment. Once people began believing they had not been understood, they stopped listening for explanations. Claire looked toward the conference table again. Another folder closed. Another advisor leaned back in silence. The room felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. Ethan Caldwell remained standing near the center of the discussion. He was doing everything a skilled executive should do. He was listening, clarifying, reassuring, but every answer seemed to move further away from the actual problem. He was treating symptoms while the cause remained untouched. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She knew exactly what needed to be said. She knew exactly why the wording had created concern. More importantly, she knew how to explain it in a way both sides would understand. The knowledge sat heavily in her chest. For years, she had trained herself not to draw attention. Life had taught her that survival often depended on staying unnoticed. Yet there were moments when remaining silent became its own kind of mistake. A delegate slowly rose from his chair. The movement was polite, respectful. Several others followed, not fully leaving yet, but preparing to. The message was clear. They were losing faith in the process. Ethan saw it immediately. The color drained slightly from his face. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Claire to notice. The room had reached a crossroads. One path led toward recovery, the other toward collapse. Claire set down the tray she had been carrying. Her manager noticed. "Claire, where are you going?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "I think there is a misunderstanding in the negotiation." The manager blinked. "The negotiation?" Claire nodded. "I believe I know what it is." He stared at her for a moment, as if unsure whether he had heard correctly. Before he could respond, Claire took a slow breath and stepped away from the service area. Her heart pounded, not from fear of being wrong, from fear of not being heard. Every step toward the conference table felt strangely loud. The executives nearest the aisle looked up as she approached. Several appeared confused. One frowned. Another glanced toward hotel management. Ethan was in the middle of answering another question when he noticed movement near the edge of the room. His eyes landed on Claire. For a brief moment, recognition flashed across his face. The waitress. The woman with the inexpensive shoes. The woman he had barely considered important enough to remember. Claire stopped a respectful distance from the table. The room grew quieter. Conversations faded. Even the rain against the windows seemed distant. She folded her hands calmly in front of her. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft, professional, certain. "Excuse me," she said. "I believe the issue is not the agreement itself. I believe the issue is how one particular phrase is being understood." The silence that followed felt endless. Dozens of eyes turned toward her at once. Some skeptical, some surprised, some openly confused. Ethan stared at her for a long second, then at the negotiation documents, then back at her. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he did not tell her to leave. For a moment, nobody moved. The executives nearest Claire looked as though they had forgotten how to react. One translator frowned openly. An attorney exchanged an incredulous glance with a colleague. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a server froze in place holding a tray of water glasses. The entire room seemed suspended between confusion and curiosity. Ethan Caldwell studied Claire carefully. He remembered the brief exchange from earlier that morning. The shoes, the laughter, the dismissive assumptions. None of that made what was happening now any easier to understand. "You believe you know what the issue is?" he asked. His tone remained professional, but skepticism lingered beneath the surface. Claire nodded once. "I believe I understand why the wording is creating concern." One of the lead translators immediately leaned forward. "The translation has already been reviewed multiple times," he said. "It is accurate." Claire turned toward him respectfully. "I agree that it is accurate." The translator appeared relieved for half a second. Then Claire continued. "The problem is that accuracy and interpretation are not always the same thing." The room fell silent again. Several delegates exchanged interested looks. Ethan folded his arms. "Explain." Claire stepped closer to the display screen showing the relevant section of the agreement. Her movements remained calm, measured. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to prevent a mistake. "The phrase being discussed translates correctly on paper," she said. "But within the cultural context of the delegation receiving it, the wording suggests guidance flowing in only one direction." She pointed toward a specific sentence. "The intent here is partnership. However, the structure implies authority." One attorney quickly shook his head. "That is not what it says." Claire nodded. "I know. That is why everyone in this room is confused. You are reading the words. They are hearing the relationship behind the words. Several members of the delegation straightened in their chairs. One of them quietly whispered something to an advisor. Claire continued, "In American business culture, this phrasing sounds efficient and strategic. In their context, it can sound like one side intends to supervise the other. The difference is subtle, but in negotiations built on mutual respect, subtle differences matter." Ethan's expression changed slightly. Not agreement. Not yet. But attention. Genuine attention. Claire then addressed one of the delegates directly through the appropriate greeting customary to his region. The words flowed naturally. Respectfully. The delegate looked visibly surprised. She followed with a brief explanation using terminology and cultural references familiar to his background. The effect was immediate. Advisors who had seemed distant moments earlier leaned forward. Interpreters stopped taking notes and simply listened. One senior representative slowly smiled for the first time in over an hour. Ethan noticed every reaction. More importantly, he noticed that Claire was accomplishing something his team had failed to achieve all afternoon. She was being understood. The ballroom remained quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Nobody laughed now. Nobody looked at her shoes. Nobody seemed interested in the uniform she wore. For the first time that day, every person in the room was focused on the same thing. The waitress standing beside the conference table. And as Claire calmly prepared to explain the misunderstanding in greater detail, Ethan Caldwell realized he might have underestimated her far more than he ever imagined possible. Claire looked around the room before continuing. Every eye remained fixed on her. Executives who had dismissed her now waited for her next sentence. Delegates who had nearly abandoned the negotiation sat quietly once more. Even the translators who had challenged her earlier appeared uncertain. The room was listening. Claire turned toward the display screen and pointed to the disputed section. "The problem begins with this phrase," she said calmly. "The words themselves are correct. The intention behind them is correct. But language is more than vocabulary. Language carries history, expectations, relationships." One of the senior delegates nodded slowly. Claire continued, "When this phrase is translated literally, it suggests that one side will provide direction while the other side receives it. In American business communication, that often sounds efficient, helpful even. But in other cultures, particularly in relationships built on mutual respect, it can sound very different." She paused briefly. "It can sound like one partner has already decided who will lead and who will follow." A quiet murmur moved through the delegation. Not disagreement. Recognition. Claire saw it immediately. The misunderstanding was finally being identified. Ethan Caldwell remained silent. For perhaps the first time all day, he was not leading the conversation. He was learning from it. Claire requested permission to rephrase the section. A delegate gestured for her to continue. She rewrote the sentence verbally, replacing language that implied oversight with language emphasizing shared responsibility, mutual contribution, and collaborative decision-making. The difference seemed small. Only a few words. Yet the reaction around the table was immediate. Faces relaxed. Advisors exchanged thoughtful glances. One interpreter actually smiled. "Do you hear the difference?" Claire asked gently. "The first version focuses on authority. The second focuses on trust. Both versions describe the same business objective, but only one respects how the relationship is perceived." The senior delegate who had spoken earlier leaned forward. Through the interpreter, he responded, "That is much closer to what we believe the partnership intended." Several others nodded in agreement. Ethan glanced toward his legal team. Their expressions ranged from surprise to admiration. None of them had considered the issue from that perspective. They had spent hours defending definitions while Claire had addressed meaning. The distinction changed everything. Claire then explained how certain concepts carried emotional weight across different cultures. She spoke carefully, never sounding superior, never trying to embarrass anyone. She simply connected ideas that had remained disconnected all afternoon. With each explanation, the tension inside the ballroom eased. The negotiation that had seemed destined to fail suddenly felt possible again. Ethan found himself watching Claire with growing disbelief. Earlier that morning, he had judged her within seconds. He had seen worn shoes and a service uniform. He had assumed he understood her story. Now he realized he had known absolutely nothing. The rain outside continued falling against the windows. Inside, however, the storm was beginning to clear. And for the first time since the misunderstanding began, genuine optimism returned to the room. The room felt different now. Not because the contracts had changed. Not because the numbers had changed. The atmosphere had changed because understanding had returned. Delegates who had been preparing to leave reopened their folders. Advisors who had spent the last hour defending positions were finally discussing solutions again. The tension that had settled over the ballroom like a storm cloud was slowly beginning to lift. Claire stepped back from the table, expecting the discussion to continue without her. In her mind, she had simply pointed out a problem and offered a correction. Nothing more. But before she could return to the service area, one of the senior delegates addressed her directly. Through the interpreter, he asked a question about regional communication practices and long-term partnership expectations. Claire paused. Then she answered, not with rehearsed terminology, not with corporate jargon. She answered with clarity. She explained how different cultures often approach trust building in different ways. Some prioritized efficiency. Others prioritized relationship. Neither approach was wrong. Problems emerged only when people assumed their own approach was universal. Several delegates nodded thoughtfully. Another asked a follow-up question. Then another. Within minutes, the woman who had entered the conversation as a hotel waitress had become the most trusted voice in the room. Ethan watched in silence. The transformation felt almost unreal. Claire navigated each question effortlessly. She moved between business concepts, cultural expectations, and communication styles with remarkable ease. More impressive than her knowledge was her humility. She never tried to dominate the discussion. She never made anyone feel foolish. She simply translated understanding from one side to the other. That ability proved far more valuable than any presentation slide. One member of Ethan's executive team quietly leaned toward him. Who exactly is she? Ethan did not answer. Because he did not know. The realization bothered him more than he expected. He knew the educational backgrounds of hundreds of executives. He knew investor profiles, market forecasts, and competitor strategies. Yet he knew nothing about the person currently saving the most important negotiation of the year. Across the table, a delegate smiled warmly and thanked Claire for her explanation. The gratitude sounded genuine, not diplomatic. Genuine. Another representative commented that her interpretation reflected the spirit of partnership they had hoped to achieve from the beginning. Those words landed heavily throughout the room. For over an hour, highly paid experts had struggled to repair the misunderstanding. Claire had accomplished more in 20 minutes than all of them combined. Rain still traced patterns against the glass outside, but sunlight had begun breaking through gaps in the clouds. Thin beams of light stretched across the ballroom floor. Claire noticed them briefly before returning her attention to the discussion. She did not see herself as extraordinary. She never had. She simply understood something others had missed. Yet sometimes that was enough to change everything. Ethan looked down at the agreement resting in front of him. Then he looked at Claire. For the first time all day, he was not thinking about the deal. He was thinking about assumptions. About how quickly people judged one another. About how confidently they often got it wrong. And as the negotiation finally began moving forward again, a question settled quietly into his mind. How had someone with this level of knowledge ended up serving coffee in a hotel ballroom instead of leading conversations inside it? The remainder of the afternoon unfolded very differently from how anyone had expected. The negotiation resumed. Conversations that had stalled found momentum again. Questions that had once sounded cautious now carried genuine interest. One by one, the obstacles that had threatened the agreement began to disappear. Claire remained near the table only when someone requested clarification. The rest of the time, she quietly stepped back, allowing the delegates and executives to continue their work. That, more than anything else, impressed Ethan Caldwell. She was not seeking recognition. She was not trying to become the center of attention. She simply wanted the conversation to succeed. Hours passed. The rain outside finally stopped. Sunlight filtered through the clouds and reflected against the glass towers surrounding the hotel. Inside the ballroom, signatures were prepared. Final revisions were reviewed. Legal teams conducted their last checks. The atmosphere that had once felt fragile now carried a sense of cautious optimism. Then the moment arrived. The final version of the agreement was presented to both sides. A senior delegate reviewed the document carefully before exchanging a brief look with his colleagues. Ethan watched from across the table. Nobody spoke. The silence felt familiar. Yet this silence was different. It no longer carried tension. It carried anticipation. The delegate smiled. Slowly. Sincerely. Then he signed. The sound of the pen touching paper seemed louder than the applause that followed seconds later. Around the ballroom, people stood from their seats. Advisors shook hands. Executives congratulated one another. Cameras flashed. Reporters hurried to capture reactions. What had nearly become a public failure had transformed into a celebrated success. Ethan accepted congratulations from every direction. Investors praised his leadership. Partners thanked him for his persistence. Journalists requested comments. Yet throughout it all, his attention repeatedly drifted toward the same person. Claire had already returned to work. She was collecting empty coffee cups near the back of the ballroom as though nothing extraordinary had happened. As though she had not just saved a $2 billion international partnership. As though she had not become the reason the agreement existed at all. One of the delegates approached her personally and thanked her. Another followed. Then another. Soon several representatives who had participated in the negotiation crossed the room simply to shake her hand. Claire accepted every gesture with quiet grace. No speeches. No self-congratulation. Just gratitude. Ethan found himself standing still as he watched. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Many people spent their lives demanding recognition. Claire seemed almost uncomfortable receiving it. A member of his executive team walked over and smiled. Looks like she became the most important person in the building today. Ethan glanced toward Claire. She probably was. The executive laughed softly, assuming it was a joke. Ethan did not laugh. He meant every word. For the first time in years, he felt humbled. Not by a competitor. Not by a market shift. Not by a failed strategy. By a woman everyone had overlooked. And as the celebration continued around him, Ethan realized the most valuable lesson of the day had nothing to do with contracts, profits, or negotiations. It had everything to do with the danger of assuming you know someone's worth before you know their story. The ballroom gradually emptied as evening settled over the city. Reporters packed away equipment. Delegates headed toward private dinners and follow-up meetings. Hotel staff quietly restored order to a room that only hours earlier had stood on the edge of disaster. Claire moved through the familiar routine of clearing tables and collecting documents left behind by departing guests. The work felt ordinary, comfortingly ordinary. She preferred it that way. Recognition was temporary. Responsibility remained. She had nearly finished organizing a service station when she noticed someone approaching. Ethan Caldwell. Without cameras. Without advisors. Without the confidence that usually seemed to surround him like a second suit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the ballroom had faded into a distant hum. Ethan glanced toward the conference table where the agreement had been signed earlier that afternoon. Then back at Claire. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came simply, directly. Claire looked surprised. Not because of the apology itself. Because people in positions like Ethan's rarely offered one. "For what?" she asked. Ethan gave a small laugh. "For making assumptions." His eyes drifted briefly downward toward her shoes before returning to her face. "I looked at you this morning and decided I understood who you were." Claire remained quiet. "Turns out," he continued, "I was completely wrong." There was no defensiveness in his voice. No attempt to excuse himself. Just honesty. Claire studied him for a moment. "Most people do that," she said softly. "It does not make you unique." Ethan nodded. The answer somehow made him feel worse and better at the same time. Worse because she was right. Better because she did not seem interested in holding the mistake against him. He glanced around the nearly empty ballroom. "Can I ask you something?" Claire smiled faintly. "You have been asking questions all day." Ethan smiled back. "Fair point." He hesitated. How does someone who understands international negotiation better than half the people at that table end up working here? Claire looked toward the windows where the last traces of sunlight reflected across the Chicago skyline. "Life," she said. "Family responsibilities. Student loans. Medical bills. Timing." She shrugged gently. Nothing dramatic. Ethan knew enough about success to recognize how incomplete that answer was. Yet he also recognized a boundary. Some stories were earned, not demanded. "Still," he said quietly, "the world is wasting your talent." Claire considered that for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No, today I used it." Ethan looked at her and realized she genuinely believed that. She did not measure value through titles, or offices, or salary figures. She measured it through usefulness, through whether her knowledge helped someone when it mattered. The realization left him unexpectedly humbled. Around them, Hotel staff continued cleaning. Glasses clinked softly. Chairs were moved back into place. The extraordinary day was becoming ordinary again. Ethan extended his hand. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the deal. For the lesson." Claire accepted the handshake. "You are welcome." And for the first time since entering the ballroom that morning, Ethan Caldwell found himself with nothing left to say. The next morning, the Meridian International Hotel looked exactly as it always had. Guests checked in. Suitcases rolled across polished floors. Coffee brewed behind the restaurant counter. Life moved forward without any sign that a $2 billion international agreement had nearly collapsed there only a day earlier. Claire Whitmore arrived for her shift a few minutes before 7. She wore the same uniform, the same calm expression, and the same inexpensive shoes. She stepped into the employee entrance carrying a small bag and a notebook she used to track expenses and appointments. Nothing about her appearance suggested that diplomats, executives, and investors had spent the previous afternoon listening to her every word. That was the strange thing about quiet dignity. It did not need an audience. As Claire crossed the lobby, she noticed a familiar figure near the front windows. Ethan Caldwell stood alone, looking out toward the city. He turned when he heard footsteps. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan smiled. Not the polished smile he used during interviews or negotiations. A real one. "Good morning, Claire." "Good morning, Ethan." He handed her a sealed envelope. "I wanted to give you this before my flight." Claire looked at it, but did not immediately take it. "What is it?" "A thank you." She accepted the envelope and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. No contract. No publicity offer. No attempt to turn her into a headline. Just a note. Claire read it quietly. The final line made her pause. "Thank you for reminding me that value and appearance are rarely the same thing." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. "Thank you," she said. Ethan nodded. "I suspect that lesson will save me from more mistakes than any business seminar ever could." They shared a brief laugh. Then an announcement echoed through the lobby. Ethan's car had arrived. "Time to leave." He extended his hand one last time. Claire shook it. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too," she replied. Ethan walked toward the exit. Halfway to the doors, he glanced back. Claire was already helping an elderly guest locate the breakfast area. The moment was so ordinary that it felt perfect. She was exactly the same person she had been before the negotiation. The only difference was that now a few more people understood her worth. Outside, sunlight reflected across the glass buildings of downtown Chicago. Ethan stepped into the waiting car and looked once more at the hotel entrance before the vehicle disappeared into traffic. Inside, Claire returned to work. Quietly, gracefully, without needing recognition to validate what she already knew. Because some people spend their lives trying to look important. Others simply become important when the moment calls for it. And sometimes the wisest person in the room is the one nobody notices until everyone else runs out of answers. If this story reminded you of someone whose strength is often overlooked, perhaps share their name in the comments below. And if stories about quiet courage, hidden wisdom, and unexpected dignity speak to you, consider subscribing so we can continue discovering the extraordinary people hiding behind ordinary appearances. After all, the quiet ones are rarely as ordinary as they seem.